Yep, fantastic. Thanks, Kerry.
Okay, this one's in regard to thermal bridging. If I install metal top hat battens on a timber frame and trusses, will I need to provide a thermal break to the battens?
I'll probably take that one, Kerry. In terms of the thermal bridging mitigation measures, my understanding that no, it wouldn't apply if you've got a timber frame and then you just put a metal top hat. You might need to meet the thermal break requirements where you've got a direct fix such as that, but you wouldn't need to meet the thermal bridging requirements in that circumstance. It's just from the inside to the outside of the frame as it passes through the frame itself, as opposed to a top hat or a batten installed.
Okay, Stuart has asked, is there any news on BASIX and how it will affect the NCC?
I'll probably take that one again, Kerry. So it's a really good question. And I did touch on this earlier in the presentation. And yes, New South Wales has the BASIX system as opposed to adopting the national NCC provisions that we've talked about today. And the BASIX provisions do have essentially the whole of house provisions already part of it. In our discussions with the New South Wales government, Stuart, they haven't completely confirmed about what their intentions are. I think they're watching what's happening with the national provisions. But I think the likelihood of the potential would be that they'll watch what the national provisions do, and then potentially would be transitioning not moving away from BASIX at all, but the thermal settings for the building fabric under the BASIX, potentially that would be adjusted to be set to align with the 7-star requirements. And in terms of the DIY provisions under the BASIX system, adjusting some of that to further align with the work that's been done on the elemental deemed to satisfy provisions. We understand that the New South Wales government has been looking at undertaking their own regulation impact statement to look at the costs and benefits of making some changes. But my understanding would be that they'd certainly be maintaining the BASIX system, but potentially changing the thermal setting scores to be aligned with the sort of 7-star which is being progressed through the national approach. I hope that helps, but if you want to follow up with that one, please feel free to follow up and reach out to us. Thanks, Kerry.
Okay, Tori has said, those proposed building element tables look complicated enough to be incorporated into a calculation tool like the Windows tool and a proposed appliances tool. Could the ABCB consider developing a calculation tool for building element R values?
I might pass that one on to Mike. If you're there, Mike, any thoughts on creating a tool for the building fabric like you've created for the whole of house and your lighting and your facade calculators and things like that, but those lookup tables to maybe make them into an ABCB calculator?
Thanks, Simon. I hope you can hear me.
Yep.
Yep, cool. Yep. That is something that's under consideration. The consultant who developed all of the provisions with us has actually had a go at doing some draft ones. I think that you're right, Tori. I think it was they would lend themselves to a lookup table. Whether it's developed by the ABCB or another part of industry or another industry association who wanted to put one together, I think it would be relatively simple to do. So I can't guarantee one will come from the ABCB, but it is something that we're considering.
Okay,
thanks, Mike,
Sydney.
and thanks, Tori.
Sydney has asked, please explain how to achieve thermally broken aluminium increase.
We might need to take that one offline, Kerry, and follow up to specifically get a bit more detail on that question. And we might answer that one afterwards, just getting a little bit more detail on the question. Yep.
Okay, Rodney has asked, can we use a NatHERS assessment instead of a BASIX certificate in New South Wales for building approval?
I'll try and answer that one, Kerry. My understanding is the answer to that one is no. Whilst the code is a performance-based building code, and the performance requirement in New South Wales doesn't specifically mention BASIX itself, but it is applied through the planning system. And I think it'd be unlikely that you'd be able to do just a NatHERS in lieu of the national provisions. But I should make the note that the NatHERS system uses the NatHERS tools for the doing of the simulation. So they're not different tools. The simulation that's done for the building fabric in New South Wales does use the NatHERS tools and things like this. So you couldn't, my understanding is you couldn't not apply the BASIC system and apply the national provisions in New South Wales. You would need to follow the BASIC system. But I would make the point that, yeah, the simulation tools that you do for the thermal assessment in New South Wales are using the NatHERS tools for that assessment. Mike, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add on that one.
No, that's my understanding as well. That definitely NatHERS is part of BASICS in a way, shape, or form. But yeah, the New South Wales government regulations do require BASICS. It's a question for the New South Wales government to answer fully, though. So, but I think you answered it pretty well, Simon.
Okay, Steve has asked, how will an assessor know what space heating or cooling will be used in a new build when it's not included in the contract?
Hassan, I don't know if you had it. Mike, yep.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So from a DTS perspective, if it's not specified, you don't know what it's going to be, there is an option within the calculator which is other. It does assume the worst in terms of the how that space is going to be heated or cooled. It would predict, it's electric resistance heating, for example, is the default. But there is an option which then guides you to what the, most likely in that case, if you don't know what the heating and cooling system is going to be, then it will probably end up with a requirement to add in some solar to make sure that you're meeting the whole of home target. But yeah, there is an option there. I'm not sure. I think the NatHERS whole of home tool will be taking a similar approach to that. Is that if you don't know, it'll assume the worst.
Yeah, that's my understanding of the NatHERS system as well. There's in the new whole of home tools, there is default settings for choosing what sort of heating appliances and cooling appliances and things like this. But I think certainly this is going to need to be a conversation that happens earlier in the process in terms of the design, because it then may impact about needing to put panels or other things into the building. So as a whole of home assessment, going forward, the conversation with the assessor and getting the details down earlier is going to be really important, rather than being done later in the build process, later in the design process. Hassan, I don't know if you wanted to have any comments on that one.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, from what I've seen, looking sort of a little bit behind the scenes on what's going on in that space, currently the pilot system as developed by Sustainability Victoria, which uses the First Rate 5 tool. The actual energy assessment is still done on First Rate 5. It's then uploaded to the portal, and on the portal, the additional information for the whole of house is entered. Again, this is the pilot sort of scenario, what's sort of what we're testing behind the scenes. But moving forward, from my understanding, through First Rate 5 and other software such as Hero, is potentially that the software itself would be considering all the elements in the actual assessment to produce a uniformed approach and a certificate which represents all that information. Again, this is still in development, still speculative, but I do hope that moving forward, that the whole of house is performed on, if we're using a tool to model the whole of house approach, it is done purely on the actual tool itself. That way we can get a good expectation, and we can also see what's going on live rather than sort of bits and pieces along the way.
Thanks, Hassan. Kerry, I'm happy to have a couple more if you'd like. We've got them come through.
Greg has asked, 75 millimeter Hebel has an R value of 1.3, but there doesn't seem to be an allowance for Hebel. How do you treat Hebel in the tables?
I might start on this one, and then Mike might have some other thoughts as well. But certainly the provisions in the lookup tables under the elemental have the brick veneer, and then they have either a cavity masonry in some places a blockwork, as you saw in my examples. They then talk about if you have lightweight, about what you need to do. And at the moment, there's not a defined term of what lightweight means under those elemental provisions. It has some explanatory information, but I think that certainly is something that needs a bit more thought, as it would be applicable to the likes of an AAC type of, or a Hebel, about its performance. I think that might be something difficult also for the elemental provisions, but through using a star rating approach and using the inherent properties of the cladding systems themselves, that's where the star rating tool will probably be more dynamic in that regard, where it actually be able to take into consideration the inherent properties of the cladding to be able to come up with the total R value for the whole wall system, and taking account of the cladding itself. But I think certainly there needs a definition in the elemental provisions about what lightweight is considered, and as you said, that the likes of an AAC panel has quite excellent insulating properties in its own right, and to be just taken as it being lightweight, like a weatherboard, for instance, isn't a true reflection of its performance. And as you saw, if it's a lightweight, then you have to put the additional R value into the wall. So I think that's something that certainly could be some improvements to the elemental provisions themselves. Mike, I don't know if you'd like to have any other comments on that one.
No, I appreciate the feedback. I definitely take that on notice. It's one of those ones where the DTS can't cover every single eventuality in terms of for elemental building construction, but yeah, and I think that your point about you may use the NatHERS pathway through maybe more suited for Hebel, but we could look at developing some guidance about how you would use Hebel in these scenarios, and how to work with the DTS elemental provisions. So, but I might take that on notice and think about it.
Yep, thanks, Mike. That's a really good question. Thanks.
Okay, Sydney has asked, in DTS elemental provisions, there was a mention of subfloor and subfloor walls insulation had to be achieved depending on height. The question is, how is the height determined?
Thanks, Sydney, for that question. I think my understanding is the height measured from the ground level to the underside of the flooring, similar to the way you would do it for when you need to determine subfloor ventilation and termite clearances and things like this. So I think it's based on that measurement of the floor height there, and then depending on the different height you might have, just say it's 450, then there's a 450 part to the table. If it's less than 450, then it goes upwards all the way up to 2.4. So if you've got a very high elevated design about what you might need to do from your subfloor wall, and then also in some climate zones, you also need the subfloor wall as well as the subfloor in between the joists as well for the insulation. So I think that is the way it's described in the provisions, but I could certainly follow up with you, Sydney, if you like, to have a bit more of a look at that one for you.
Okay, Michael has asked, does the whole of home for heating and cooling include the performance entry of energy efficiency ratios? In that case, manufacturers use performance ratings in lieu of star rating.
I think we might need a bit more information on that one, Kerry, to be able to answer that question. Unless, Mike, you can piece it together from that question.
Yep, I think they're talking about the difference between the EER ratings or IPLV ratings in some cases, or coefficients of performance for air conditioning equipment, as opposed to the GEM star ratings. The tools that, or the tool that we've got in terms of the calculators I put forward, and the whole of home standard, which is the new document, which has got all those combinations of appliances, does run off the GEM star ratings in terms of the input. terms of EER, that's something I will be, I'm pretty sure, an input that you can use within the NatHERS whole of home tools. And First Rate 5 has mentioned there's an Accurate version that's coming out, and hopefully all of the existing NatHERS tool providers will develop a whole of home approach. Can look into a process or a description of how you can combine or use EER ratings in lieu of GEMS star ratings if they're not published by a manufacturer. Don't have that material available at the moment, but if we do have further consultation ongoing on all these provisions, including meetings with the air conditioning and refrigeration manufacturers towards the end of this next week, and so can pursue that question further.
Okay, Amy has asked, lighting density is currently dependent on the use of the room. For example, dwelling 5 watt, garage 4 watt, external 3. Does the new 4 watt requirements as per H6P2 override this? And are there any restrictions around garage and exterior lighting calculations?
I can answer that as well, if that's okay, Simon. So the 4 watts per square meter is the amount that's used to set the energy budget for the house. It's not actually a new 4 watts per square meter requirement that now needs to be met. It's just an assumption that an efficient house, which is essentially what we're looking for through the whole of home requirement, we've got a group of appliances and lighting, and saying that sort of sets your energy budget. The actual lighting requirements in terms of that 5 watts per square meter and 4 watts per square meter in garages are unchanged. So that there's still a DTS requirement for lighting, which is separate to the whole of home approach, which is only there to set the budget by which your overall compliance needs to be met.
Thanks very much for that, Mike. Kerry, we might take one more. I know we've probably run fairly well over today, but I think there's been some great questions and great content, so we'll just take one more.
Okay, yeah, there are still a lot of questions on there, but as I said, we can get back to people after the webinar. So the DTS requires that slabs on ground in certain climate zones are to be waffle slabs. If a conventional raft slab constructed under AS 2870, I hope I said that correctly, is to be used, what will that require a performance solution?
In terms of a traditional slab on ground in those circumstances, the question's right, that yes, under the elemental provisions, it is saying to use a waffle pod slab. Going forward, if they wanted to use a traditional slab on ground, as we saw in Hassan's presentation, there is going to be options to do that through a NatHERS assessment, so that is still deemed to satisfy. That's not a performance solution. So under a NatHERS assessment, it still will allow the situation of using a slab on ground, depending on the permutations of the assessment and things like that. So that would be the pathway for doing that one under the revised approach. So good question. So I think that might wrap it up, Kerry. I think I'm sure there's a lot more questions to come and things like this. And as you said, we're happy to take any of them. That you can also put them into your survey, and the team and I will follow up on those questions for any ones we didn't get to today. So I thank everyone for your time today. I thank all of our speakers, a lot of speakers today. I thank the time spent in putting these things together, and our sponsors, Bondor, Metecno, and Stans Australia for your generous support as well. I thank ABCB for your time, and Mike and Hassan. And yeah, thanks everyone for making time today. If you're coming tomorrow to our webinar on the condensation provisions, I'll see you then. And we'll send out these recordings to you in the next few days. We'll hopefully try and cut them down to get rid of any of those lags or frozen issues, and appreciate your patience with any of the technical challenges today. So thank you very much, and thanks, Kerry.
Thanks, Simon. Have a good afternoon, everybody.